70 billion euros. That is what NATO just promised Ukraine for this year alone, with a matching pledge written into the same document for next year. A 2-year commitment worth around $160 billion, signed in Ankara 2 days ago by 32 governments who all insist, with perfectly straight faces, that what they want most in the world is for this war to end. And that is the question sitting underneath the whole summit, the one nobody at the podium wanted to say out loud. If everyone wants it over, why does every plan they sign quietly assume it isn't? Read the Ankara Declaration closely and you notice something. The language of ending the war is soft, aspirational, deferred. The language of arming for it is specific, funded, and stretched out across the next decade. One of those two things is a wish, the other is a budget. And budgets are where you find out what people actually believe. This is Professor Alex, and if you want the version of these stories that follows the money instead of the microphone, subscribe, because that's the whole job here. Now back to Ankara. It's July 10th. The leaders have flown home. The stage lights in Turkey are down, the family photo is filed, and the headlines have already moved on to the next thing. Which is exactly when the interesting part starts, because the summit didn't really produce peace or a path to it. It produced procurement. More than $50 billion in new weapons orders announced on the spot. A reaffirmed commitment for every member to spend 5% of its entire economy on defense by 2035, 3.5% on core military capability, another 1.5% on the wider security machinery around it. And a number that should stop you. Since last year's summit in The Hague, European allies and Canada have already poured an additional $139 billion into core defense. That's not a plan to spend, that's spent, committed, flowing. So hold those two facts next to each other. A war that, by every official account, everyone is desperate to wind down, and a rearmament program built to run until 2035. You don't build a 10-year machine to solve a problem you expect to be gone next spring. You build it because, somewhere below the diplomatic surface, the planning assumption is that the confrontation is permanent. Not this exact war, maybe, but the standoff, the threat, the reason to keep buying. Let me be careful here, because this is where these stories usually go off the rails. I'm not going to tell you there's a room full of men in suits who conspired to keep Ukrainians dying so a tank company's stock could go up. There's no evidence of that, and anyone who tells you otherwise is selling you a feeling, not a fact. The truth is quieter and, honestly, more unsettling than a conspiracy. Because a conspiracy you could arrest. What's actually happening doesn't require anyone to be evil. It just requires a lot of institutions to each do the thing that's rational for them, and for all those rational choices to add up to a machine that has no reverse gear. Think about who was in Ankara and what each of them needed to walk away with. Mark Rutte, the Secretary General, needed to show Washington that Europe is finally paying its share, so he brought the numbers. A year ago it was promises, he said. This year, it's delivery. Trump needed a win he could take home, and he got one. Allies scrambling to hit 5%, a defense burden visibly shifting off American shoulders. The Turkish host, Erdogan, needed the summit to run smoothly and to put his own defense industry on the map. Zelenskyy needed money and air defense, and he spent 2 days in something like 20 back-to-back meetings chasing exactly that. Every single one of those people got something out of a war that continues. Not one of them got anything out of it ending this week. And when a system is built so that continuation pays and resolution doesn't, you don't need villains. You just need Tuesday. Now watch how the money actually moves, because this is where it stops being abstract. There's a German company called Rheinmetall. Makes tanks, makes ammunition, makes air defense. 4 years ago, it was a middling industrial name most Americans had never heard of. Since Russia's invasion in 2022, its stock is up somewhere around 1,700%. Not 17, 1,700. Its market value is pushing $80 billion, and it's guiding for sales growth of 40 to 45% this year. That is not the financial profile of a company betting on peace. That is a company whose order book runs years deep, whose customers are governments legally committed to spending more every year through 2035, whose entire valuation is built on the assumption that the danger doesn't go away. And here's the part that complicates the easy story. Even that stock has wobbled this year. The broader European defense sector actually cooled in the first half of 2026. The aerospace and defense index basically flat while the wider market climbed. Investors got picky. When Germany canceled a big frigate program over cost overruns, Rheinmetall shares dropped. So it's not a straight line to the moon. The market is starting to ask harder questions. Which of these companies can actually build the things they've promised, and which are just riding sentiment? But notice what the cooling is about. It's not doubt that the spending is coming. Nobody doubts that. It's a fight over who captures it. The river is guaranteed. They're just arguing about the shape of the riverbed. And it isn't just the one German name. Watch what the whole sector did in the days right before the summit even opened. Italy's Fincantieri jumped almost 13% in a single session. Leonardo, Saab, Thales, Hensoldt, Dassault, all of them climbed. And they climbed on a specific trigger. Rutte telling a newspaper that the alliance's spending is stretching manufacturers past their limits. Read that again because it's almost too on the nose. The head of NATO says the factories can't keep up with the war orders, and the immediate market reaction is to bid up the factories. Bad news for capacity is good news for the stock, because it means the demand is bottomless, and the pricing power belongs to whoever can build. When a warning about strain reads as a buy signal, you're looking at a market that has fully priced in years of continuation. Saab's order bookings jumped 74% in a single year to a record. BAE Systems, Britain's biggest, everything from submarines to Typhoon jets, sitting on a backlog it will take years to work through. This is an entire industry whose defining problem right now is not finding customers. It's building fast enough to satisfy the ones already lined up out the door. Rutte himself said something in the run-up to Ankara that I keep turning over. He warned that the flood of orders is straining the manufacturers, that around $300 billion in weapons has already been ordered from American suppliers, and that the industry is hitting what he called the absorption capacity level. Sit with that phrase. The bottleneck is no longer money. It's not political will. It's whether the factories can physically make enough. When your constraint shifts from, will they fund it, to, can we build it fast enough, you have crossed from a temporary emergency into a standing industry. Emergencies wind down. Industries defend themselves. So who wants this war to never end? Let me give you the honest answer, which is not the satisfying one. Almost nobody wants the killing to continue. But an enormous number of institutions are now structurally dependent on the threat continuing. And those are not the same thing. And the gap between them is where the danger lives. Consider it from the seat of a European finance minister. For 30 years, defense was the budget line you cut to pay for everything voters actually wanted. It was political poison. Now it's the one line that's protected, expanding, and blessed by Washington. Whole regions are being rebuilt around it. Factories, jobs, tax revenue, supply chains. In Germany, defense-linked industrial orders jumped more than 50% late last year. Ammunition production across the EU went from a few 100,000 rounds a year before the invasion to something like 2 million by the end of 2025. That's not a temporary surge. That's a new economic base. And once a town's paychecks depend on that base, the war ended, the orders stopped, becomes a sentence no local politician ever wants to say. The incentive to keep the threat alive doesn't come from malice. It comes from payroll. Now flip to the other side of the Atlantic, because the American story is different, and in some ways more revealing. The Trump administration walked into Ankara pushing something it calls NATO 3.0. The idea, stripped down, is that Europe takes over the heavy lifting of its own defense, so America can turn its attention elsewhere, to Asia, to the Pacific, to China. And on paper, that sounds like a president trying to wind down American entanglement. But look at what it actually produces. Rutte's own framing was that this shift means European allies who are far more capable of buying, and here's the quiet part, buying largely American. $300 billion in orders already placed with U.S. suppliers. When Trump stood next to Zelenskyy and said America would show Ukraine how to produce Patriot systems, that wasn't charity. Patriots are one of the most lucrative defense exports on Earth. Europe should defend itself, and Europe should buy American weapons to do it, are, conveniently, the same policy. And this is the thing the podium never quite tells you. The pitch to the public is burden shifting, America doing less. The reality in the ledgers is burden shifting as market expansion. The U.S. isn't leaving the business, it's franchising it, getting allies to foot the bill while American defense firms keep the contracts. That's not a criticism of any one person, it's just what the structure rewards, and everyone in that structure is responding to the reward. And here's where the second war matters, the one that isn't Ukraine. Because Ankara didn't just talk about Russia. The declaration went out of its way to name Iran, to say Tehran must never get a nuclear weapon, and to demand it respect free navigation through the Strait of Hormuz. That's the summit reaching past its own continent to plant a flag on the world's most important oil choke point. And it's not theoretical. The U.S.-Israeli war on Iran this spring already sent a jolt through crude markets and put the Hormuz question back on every trading desk on Earth. Roughly a fifth of the world's oil moves through that strait. When it looks threatened, prices move. And when prices move, that's a cost that lands on every American filling a tank in Ohio or Texas. So watch what the alliance is quietly becoming. It started as a project to deter one country in Europe. It's now writing itself into the security of a waterway in the Persian Gulf. The mission keeps expanding. And every expansion of the mission is, downstream, an expansion of the market. Another theater, another threat, another line item, another reason the 5% number looks less like a ceiling and more like a floor. The defense build isn't just about Russia anymore. It's about a world that keeps generating new places to point the machine. So let's talk about the war itself, the actual thing underneath all this, because it's easy to lose the human center in a conversation about order books. Nearly 4 years in, this war has killed more than 1 million people across both sides, and the peace process, the thing everyone in Ankara swore fealty to, has been effectively frozen since the Geneva talks earlier this year collapsed without a breakthrough. Back in December, Zelenskyy said 90% of a deal had been agreed. 90%. And yet here we are. Because the last 10% is the only 10% that ever mattered. What happens to the Donbass, and what security guarantees Ukraine actually gets. Russia wants territory Ukraine still holds and won't give up. Ukraine wants ironclad guarantees the West has never been willing to fully write. And the whole thing stalled further when the Iran war pulled American attention east this spring. 90% agreed, and it might as well be zero. That should tell you something about how these things really work. The war doesn't continue because the two sides are miles apart on everything. It continues because they're close on everything, except the questions that go to the heart of whether either regime survives the peace. And into that frozen space, the machine keeps building. More air defense, more drones, more 10-year contracts. Every month, the guns don't stop. The case for the next contract gets easier to make. Here's a detail from the summit that I can't stop thinking about. While the leaders were in Ankara talking about supporting Ukraine, Russia was hitting Kyiv. Missile strikes during the summit killed at least 3 people and wounded 14, one of them a teenager. So you had this split screen. Inside the hall, declarations, procurement announcements, the careful language of unity. Outside, a few hundred miles away, the actual war, indifferent to all of it, killing people in real time. That gap, between the ceremony of managing a war and the reality of fighting one, is the whole story. The summit produced $80 billion of support and 0 reduction in the shelling of Kyiv. The machine ran perfectly, the war ran on. And the unity itself? Thinner than the family photo suggests. Trump spent much of the summit not celebrating allies, but airing grievances against them. He revived his push to take Greenland from Denmark, a fellow NATO member, until the Danish Prime Minister had to stand there and say, out loud, that Greenland is not for sale. He was openly feuding with Italy's Giorgia Meloni, a leader once considered his closest friend in Europe, even posting a jab about a restraining order. He was furious that allies wouldn't help him in the Iran war. So the picture of a confident, united alliance marching in lockstep toward a clear goal, that's the brochure. The reality is 32 governments who agree on almost nothing except one thing, that everyone should spend more on defense. Think about what it means that spending is the only real consensus. When an alliance can't agree on strategy, or on how the war ends, or even on which territories belong to whom, but can agree, unanimously and enthusiastically, on buying more weapons, the spending has stopped being a means to an end. It's become the end. The one thing they can all say yes to. There's one more layer to this, and it's the one that makes the machine almost impossible to switch off. This war didn't just create demand for weapons, it rewrote what a weapon even is. For 70 years, European defense meant tanks, jets, artillery, big, expensive, slow-to-build platforms. Then Ukraine turned the front into a drone war. Cheap, expendable, lethal machines, made and burned through by the tens of thousands. And Europe realized all at once that it wasn't built for that. So look at the scramble. France committing billions to expand its drone and ammunition stockpiles, aiming for a 400% increase in explosive drones before 2030. Germany and Ukraine signing a multi-billion euro package that includes joint drone production. The EU launching a whole initiative to build a counter-drone shield across the continent. Zelenskyy spent his time in Ankara not just asking for air defense, but chasing drone deals, with Estonia, the Netherlands, Denmark, more expected with Germany and Norway and Canada. Here's why that matters for the question we're asking. A tank you build once and it lasts 30 years. A drone you build, you fly, and it's gone, sometimes the same afternoon. An entire military doctrine now runs on consumables, on things designed to be destroyed and immediately reordered. Think about what that does to an industry's incentive structure. The old model sold you a thing. The new model sells you a subscription to a war. You don't stockpile drones and stop. You burn them at the rate you fight, which means the reorder never ends as long as the fighting doesn't. Ukraine didn't just create a surge in defense spending, it created the template for defense spending that renews itself indefinitely. And every general and every finance ministry watching that front is now redesigning their procurement around the assumption that this is the future. Which is another way of saying they're building institutions around the permanence of exactly the kind of war they claim to want finished. Now I want to steelman the other view, because the honest version of this story has to. There's a completely legitimate case that all this spending is not a racket, but a rational response to a genuine threat. Russia really did invade. Russia really is described, in the Ankara Declaration, as a long-term threat to European security, and not by hawks looking for a paycheck, but by 32 governments reading the same intelligence. From a Polish or Baltic or Finnish perspective, a decade of rearmament isn't a scheme, it's insurance against a neighbor that has shown it will cross borders. Poland is already spending well over 4% of its economy on defense and doesn't need Washington to twist its arm, because Poland can see the map. When you live next to the fire, buying more water isn't a conspiracy, it's sanity. And most Americans, for what it's worth, still back the alliance. A survey just before the summit found roughly 2/3 want to maintain or increase U.S. commitment to NATO. So the endless war profiteers story, told without this other half, is a lie of omission. But here's where I land, and I want to be precise about it. Both things are true at once, and that's what makes it hard. The threat is real, and the incentives are real. Russia is genuinely dangerous, and the defense industry genuinely profits from that danger continuing. A war can be both a tragedy the West is trying to end and a business the West has quietly reorganized itself around. Those don't cancel out, they coexist. And the reason that matters, the reason it's not just cynicism, is this. When your entire security architecture, your industrial base, your political consensus, and your allies' stock markets all quietly depend on the threat persisting, you lose the ability to see clearly whether it does. Every institution now has a reason to find Russia threatening, whether or not the threat is growing or shrinking. That's not corruption. It's something more dangerous. It's a whole system that can no longer perceive peace as a win, because peace, for that system, reads as a loss of purpose and funding. Follow that logic to where it actually leads. If a ceasefire were signed tomorrow, real, durable, holding, what happens to the $139 billion spending ramp? To Rheinmetall's 1,700% run? To the German factory towns, the Polish arms deals, the American contractors sitting on $300 billion in orders? None of it disappears overnight. These commitments run to 2035 by design. But the story that justifies them gets harder to tell. And so, without anyone deciding it, the system develops a mild allergy to the very outcome it claims to want. Not sabotage, just a thumb, resting gently on the scale, in 1,000 small decisions, all of them defensible on their own. That's why the peace process can be 90% done and still frozen solid. Not because a cabal is blocking it, because nobody with real power is desperate to finish it. The urgency that built the weapons machine was never matched by an equal urgency to make it unnecessary. And an emergency that no longer feels urgent to the people managing it doesn't end. It just becomes the weather. Permanent. Budgeted. Normal. So what do you actually watch for from here if you want to know which way this breaks? Watch the order books more than the communiques. Watch whether that European defense sector keeps cooling or reignites, because the market is, in its cold way, voting on whether it believes this lasts. Watch whether the 5% target survives contact with reality, or whether countries like Spain, which barely reached 2% and called 5% unreasonable, quietly start slipping. Watch whether the next round of peace talks gets a real deadline with real consequences, or another round of meaningful progress that produces nothing. And watch the absorption capacity problem, because if the factories genuinely can't keep up, that's the one force that could break the cycle. Not diplomacy, not conscience, but a supply chain that simply can't build fast enough to keep the machine fed. Because in the end, the uncomfortable thing Ankara revealed isn't that someone is plotting to keep the war going. It's that we've built a system so thoroughly organized around the threat that ending it has quietly become the option nobody's structurally rooting for. The war persists not because it's wanted, but because its ending is no longer needed by the people who could deliver it. And a war that nobody needs to end is a war that doesn't. So let me leave you with the question the whole summit was built to avoid. If every leader in that room genuinely wants peace, but every institution they answer to is now quietly built to survive on the war, which one do you think actually decides how this ends? This is Professor Alex. I'll see you in the next one.